Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to this joint webinar between Landmark Chambers and Browne Jacobson. Today we're going to be covering net zero carbon emissions, biodiversity in planning and air quality issues in planning. We're absolutely delighted that there are so many of you, albeit virtually, with us today. And we do hope that you'll find what we have to say both valuable and informative. My name's Richard Barlow. I'm going to endeavour to chair today's session, and I'm joined by my colleague Ben Standing, and we're delighted to have David Elvin QC and James Maurici QC from Landmark Chambers here as well. And I will introduce each of them formally in a few moments. Firstly, if I may, just one or two housekeeping points. You should note that your own microphones are automatically muted, so there should be no need for you to adjust any settings from that perspective. Please ask us questions, we welcome them. You can submit them at any point throughout the session using the Q&A section at the top or bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to respond to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. We are recording this webinar and at the end, shortly after, you'll be sent a link both to the slides presentation and also to the recording of the webinar just a little after the conclusion. Should you lose connection at any point during the webinar, simply rejoin the meeting by the same means as you originally joined. Just click on that link again. I'm afraid I'm unable to provide the usual fire precautions advice that we give at the start of seminars. I'm afraid you'll all have to be aware of your own surroundings and take appropriate action should the fire alarm bell sound. We will include a 5-minute break between sessions 2 and 3, so that is likely to be around probably a little bit before midday, perhaps about 2:45, 10 to midday, something like that. So now I'm going to introduce our presenters to you today. First off this morning will be Ben Standing. Ben is a senior associate at Browne Jacobson. He's been with us for over 10 years. He specialises in environmental and planning law. He has spent time seconded to both Welsh Government and the Marine Management Organisation, with both of whom he continues to work as his clients as well. Ben is dedicated to being green, and I can tell you that he's a particularly fine gardener and horticulturalist. Growing chili pepper plants is a specialism of his. So Ben is going to be covering net zero, the legal aspects. And I'd now like to just introduce David and James. David Elvin, one of the country's most prevalent and sought after members of the Planning and Environmental Bar. Well over 30 years of experience, he's a trusted advisor to many organisations in this field. I can tell you that it helped me to tackle a problematic litigant relating to a compulsory purchase back in 1988, and he's continued to help me and my clients navigate the complexities of planning and environmental law ever since. Today, David is going to illuminate us on biodiversity net gain in the context of planning law. James Maurici, I was fortunate enough to meet James nearly 20 years ago when he was representing the Secretary of State for the Environment. And I was immediately impressed with his calm and careful approach and his legal assessment which was both incisive and effective when deployed in argument. He has a broad planning, environmental and public law practice. I can tell you that he's a genuine pleasure to work with, and his list of successful cases is so long that I can't possibly go into it today. Many of you will know that James has recently been advising in relation to Heathrow Airport, and that has been to wide acclaim. Today, James is speaking on air quality issues in planning. And for myself, I will follow Ben, and I have been at Browne Jacobson for 30 years now, specialising in planning, environmental and public law. We have a wide range of public and corporate clients in this field. Personally, I have a niche specialism in nature conservation law. And for today's topic, net zero from the practical perspective, I've gained some insight into this in my role as chair of the Nottingham Green Partnership. And so that's my credentials for today. And with that, I am going to hand over to Ben, who will now talk us through net zero, the legal obligations.
Thank you very much, Richard. Perfect. So I'm going to be talking about net zero, the legal obligations. I'm going to talk about what net zero is, the action we have taken to implement net zero since the target came into force, and the previous obligations in relation to reducing carbon emissions. Also going to look at what's in the pipeline. Obviously, there's a lot has been happening recently. There's EU exit, there's the effects of COVID, and there's a lot of talk about building back green and the green recovery and significant reduction in carbon emissions. And I'll talk about some of the options that the government has put forward to help with that green recovery. So first up is, what is net zero? Net zero was it was actually only enshrined in legislation last year, but the concept of significant reduction in our carbon emissions was enshrined in law in the Climate Change Act of 2008. Section 1 sets out that it's the duty of the Secretary of State to ensure that the UK's carbon account for the year 2050 is 100% lower than the 1990 baseline. The 1990 baseline is the aggregate of the net UK emissions for CO2 for 1990 and the net UK emissions for the other greenhouse gases also for 1990. The way it's achieved is not just setting a target for 2050 and then slowly working towards it. There are a number of carbon budgets. These are 5-yearly periods during which there's a maximum amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that can be emitted. These are set 12 years in advance and set a steadily reducing amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that we can produce. Note that it's net because it's there's always going to be some greenhouse gases and carbon which are emitted, but those which are emitted have to be offset. There is a duty on the Secretary of State to prepare proposals and policies for meeting these budgets, and that's been occurring, and we'll discuss how that's been getting on. There's also a requirement for an annual statement on progress, and the Committee on Climate Change, the CCC, which is set up under the 2008 Act, reports back yearly on how things have been going. Looking at the report that was produced this June, they state that there's been important developments in transport, building, industry, energy supply, agriculture and land use. But importantly, these steps do not yet measure up to meet the size of the net zero challenge, and we're not making adequate progress for preparing for climate change. Clearly then, a significant amount needs to be done. They also mention in that report that only 2 of the 31 2019 progress report benchmarks have been met. And in certain situations, such as building insulation, we've actually gone backwards compared to last year. So what does the CCC state needs to be done? Well, there needs to be a significant reduction in energy demand through greater efficiency. There needs to be societal changes to reduce demand, a lot of which we've actually seen during the COVID crisis, and different ways of working and reducing the amount of journeys made and carbon emitted. There needs to be the extreme electrification. Obviously, once we have made or greened the production of electricity, we then need to use that electricity to reduce the carbon, remove the carbon from other parts of the economy. There needs to be a move to the hydrogen economy, and Richard will talk more about this in his talk after mine. And there also needs to be an increase in carbon capture and storage. All of this is needed so that we can meet not only our net zero requirements in the 2008 Act, but also our obligations under the Paris Agreement. So what has been done? Well, I can't, in the 20 minutes that I've been afforded, I can't go through every single scheme which has been put in place, all the policies, those which have been successful and those which haven't. But I have picked out a number of the bigger schemes. I'm going to very briefly talk about them and how successful they have been. I'm also going to have a look at future legislation. So first I'm going to talk about the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, or ESOS. ESOS requires larger companies and non-public sector organisations to analyse their energy use and to undertake mandatory energy saving assessments. In this process, the participants calculate the total amount of energy consumption, work out how this can be reduced, how money can be saved, and present these to the board. The idea being that once businesses realise how much money can be saved by reducing carbon and becoming more efficient and economically, ecologically friendly, environmentally friendly, they will be keen to jump on this and to implement these measures. Compliance with the scheme is mandatory, but compliance with the requirements identified in the reports is not. There must be information provided back to the scheme administrator, which in England is the EA, in Wales is NRW. There needs to be evidence kept about how ESOS has been complied with, and this evidence needs to be kept for 8 years. The idea of ESOS is to look at things such as buildings, transport, and industrial processes, all of which is very positive, and failure to actually comply with the scheme can lead to enforcement action being taken. However, these are only going to be civil enforcement mechanisms, penalties up to £50,000. A powerful tool can also be naming and shaming, so there can be the publication of those that fail to comply with ESOS. But most importantly, although you have to go through the process, you don't actually have to implement the requirements and the energy savings identified. And actually, the government's own report in looking into ESOS states that very few organisations actually do implement the required savings. It's hard to understand why, but apart from a lot of these savings identified over quite a long time frame, and it might be that looking over a 10-year time frame isn't realistic for businesses trying to implement this. It also only applies to a relatively high threshold of businesses, so it doesn't necessarily reach everywhere it needs to reach. On the plus side, it's positive that boardrooms are talking about this and companies are being made to undertake the assessment, because that's half the battle. undertaking the assessment and understanding where you could make savings, it's then only a small leap to actually then making those savings and reducing the carbon produced. Next, I'm going to talk about the Energy Efficiency Building Renovation and Reporting Amendment Regulations 2020. Nice, snappy title. And they're only going to be enforced for a relatively short period of time. They came into force in June this year, and they'll no longer have effect once we leave the European Union, which is currently going to be the 31st of December this year. So why am I talking about them? I'm talking about them because they implement something which is of interest and hasn't been done to such a large extent in existing legislation. So there's a requirement to have or to produce a long-term renovation strategy to decarbonise the existing housing stock by 2050. Housing produces some of the most carbon emissions in the country. Most homes are heated via gas boilers. There are still a surprisingly large amount of homes which aren't energy efficient. So a huge amount of energy is being produced. There's huge scope to reduce carbon, especially if through electrification, if the production of energy comes from renewable sources. But it can be expensive to retrofit buildings, and this is something which needs to be addressed. Especially because this actually building efficiency is one of the areas where the CCC has stated that the UK has gone backwards since last year. So there is meant to be a scheme, renovation strategy produced. The government has promised it imminently. In reality, considering how long these regulations are going to be enforced for, we don't know if it will be produced, but the concept of it is something that needs to be put into the mix if we're going to meet net zero. The next piece of legislation I want to talk about MEES, the Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards Regulations 2015. This is again looking at efficiency from buildings, and buildings are a major source of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. It looks at a situation where there's a landlord and tenant situation. The difficulty being identified that if you are a tenant, it can be very difficult to undertake the improvements to a building if the landlord doesn't want you to. What the regulations mean that the landlords should allow tenants to make energy efficiency improvements, and they should grant their consent, and they shouldn't withhold that consent unreasonably, even if it's contrary to the requirements in the lease. There's also a requirement that in substandard properties, those with an EPC rating of F or below, they can't lease it to a new person or continue with existing leases until the property is brought up to the relevant or above an F on EPC. This sounds really positive, but in practice there are a number of legitimate reasons that can be stated for landlords not to actually implement these improvements. A lot of it talks about the cost, the impact on the building, how long it's going to take to make those efficiencies pay back the capital spent on them. They're also enforced by local authorities, and because of the complexity of some of these exemptions, reports suggest that enforcement hasn't been that rigorous. Despite that, they do provide a good mechanism, a mechanism to try and improve situations for those in a tenant situation, and they provide a backdrop and something which could be built upon to help reduce carbon emissions. At the moment, they might not be reaching their full potential, but there is scope there to improve this. Finally, in relation to existing legislation, there's the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, or EU ETS. The EU ETS is, there's had a lot of commentary about it. The primary aim is to produce or put a price on the emission of carbon. By having a central amount of allowances that can be given, and those allowances slowly reducing year on year, there's the ability to reduce carbon emissions for the entire industry and to provide the market to do this rather than strict regulation. It encourages businesses to reduce carbon because they can then sell these allowances that they're given, and that can actually use this to help fund further efficiencies and improvements in energy efficiency. It only applies in relation to certain industries and tends to be the bigger players in those industries. So we have large and polluting businesses such as manufacturing, oil refining, power stations. Many have stated that it hasn't lived up to its potential, but it's one thing is clear: is it has saved a considerable amount of carbon, and it's beginning to get to a point now where it is reducing. It's beginning to force efficiencies. There's always the balance to be had between moving quickly to reducing carbon and having such an impact on the industry that actually there's a huge economic impact because businesses are unable to trade profitably. On EU exit, though, we would currently be leaving the EU emissions trading scheme. So, what's in the pipeline? Quite a few things are in the pipeline, including a UK version of the ETS. This is meant to be very similar to the European system. The aim is actually to link it into the European emissions trading system, but obviously this will depend on the course of the negotiations, and reading the news at the moment, those negotiations aren't going brilliantly right now, but that doesn't mean that a deal won't be reached in relation to this. It seems to be in both sides' interest to have a linked up and functioning emissions trading system. Interestingly, the UK is proposing setting the amount of allowances at 5% below the predicted amount of allowances that would have been given to the UK under the European system. So it's an example of the government demonstrating that they are wanting to take steps to go that extra mile to reduce emissions. There is currently some issues. There's a judicial review going on at the moment because there's been a municipal waste incinerators aren't included within the scheme, and there are a number of things which will need to be made clear. But it's a good thing that this is being moved into UK law, because overall it has been an effective way on a European level of curbing carbon emissions from those most polluting industries. And those of you with good memories might also remember the Future Home Standard. This was consulted upon October 2019, and we haven't heard a huge amount about it since, but it is mentioned in the new Planning for the Future Planning White Paper, and the response to the consultation is due this autumn, apparently. There are many good things about the Future Home Standards. The aim is to reduce carbon emissions by 75 to 80%. It's not just about making buildings more efficient, it's also focusing on the heating issue. So the installation of heat pumps and the use of heat networks, not just making a double glazing and insulation in buildings. There's a strong way of implementing this as well. They'll be implementing it through the building regulations, Part L, which is the conservation of fuel and power, and Part F, which is ventilation. So this is positive, but bear in mind it only applies to new homes. There's also a slight in the desire to get consistency and to make it easier for developers to understand what is required, local authorities won't be able to stipulate higher standards than those in the building regulations, which is a potential downside when we're working towards reduction in carbon. It's also slightly disappointing that although there will be some major changes due this year, apparently, most likely next year now, the aim is to implement these by 2025. There's currently a huge push for the new homes to be built. And it's a shame that a lot of those new homes won't necessarily be built to these standards. Retrofitting these homes to become more, to reduce carbon emissions is in itself likely to be very expensive and also produce carbon. So it could be an opportunity missed. And finally, just having a look at what's coming forward. The environment and agricultural bills are currently in the pipeline. This is an opportunity to change the system to encourage goods to reduce carbon emissions in the UK, for example, tree planting, natural carbon storage, protecting biodiversity and giving food production greater climate resilience. There's lots in there, but there's lots more that could still be done. The energy white paper, now this has been promised for quite some time, but when it does arrive, and it's promised this autumn, it is a key part of the mix. The CCC has constantly said that the first major step will be the creation of an increased source of green energy, the use of renewables that can then feed into the electrification and the decarbonisation of the rest of the economy. So watch this space. The circular economy. Again, this is all about how long products stay or how much is recycled and how long products stay being used. And it's encouraging that the government recently did a U-turn on adopting the EU circular economy recycling targets. However, the UK recycling rates have been stubbornly at about 45% for many years now. There needs to be a real push towards encouraging recycling, improving recycling rates. And finally, the slightly terrifying simplification of EIA. It's long been seen by certain members of the current government that EIA is a hindrance to development. Boris Johnson recently referred to newt counters, but I think it will be accepted by most working within EIA that the EIA regime is not perfect, it's not always as efficient as it needs to be. But whether the simplification actually means deregulation of EIA is a significant issue. EIA is the way that decision makers understand the environmental impact of their decisions, and to take away a large amount of this to help developers could mean that we don't have development which comes forward and decisions made which are aiming towards getting to net zero and meeting our environmental obligations. Ultimately, there's a big opportunity here. COVID has demonstrated that that large-scale societal changes is possible. The move to people working from home has demonstrated that there are ways that we don't need to do all of the journeys that we previously thought that we did. But COVID has also created a huge economic challenge. And the real question is, will the UK come back greener, or will its measures focus on economic growth at the expense of carbon emissions? Combining this with EU exit, which is going to provide an opportunity either for further deregulation on the environment or tools to help promote and develop the green recovery and increase the amount of carbon being emitted and to help us reach our net zero target. I personally hope that we can adapt and get a further green growth, that we can continue to meet our green obligations to get closer to getting to net zero. But again, there's so much going on, it's just watching this space at the moment. I'll now hand over to Richard Barlow, who's going to talk about the practical options and legal implications and the techniques required in order to reach net zero. Thank you.
Hi. Right. So now we're going to have a bit of a canter through some of the practical options for trying to help us introduce suitable measures to contribute towards carbon reduction and getting us closer to and achieving, hopefully, that net zero target which Ben has just explained. So I cannot for a minute begin to suggest that this is going to be a comprehensive identification of all the options. Essentially, it's my kind of selection of aspects which I think are important or which I believe are likely to make a significant contribution towards net zero targets, and so please take it in that context. There's a huge amount that we could talk about, and so I will just talk about these elements. So firstly, for some reason I don't seem to be able to move the slides. I don't know why that is. Just bear with us for a second whilst we get the slides. So let me tell you what we're going to talk about as Josh just helps us with the technology for a moment. I want to talk about the reduction of energy consumption by becoming more energy efficient. And in that context, I'll have a look at some different options for vehicles. I'd like to talk about the importance of using a green tariff. And I'd also like to talk about the way in which we can harness renewable and low carbon sources of energy. And so we'll take a look at those. In addition, I'm going to talk about the reduction of indirect emissions. And in that context, I'd like to have a look at green procurement and also just take a quick scan at embodied carbon, because I think that's really important. I'd also like to take a look at the purchasing of carbon offsets and kind of whether or not regulation is required, carbon offsetting. And then finally, just finish with a few words on green bonds and their possible contribution that they can make. So, hey, finally, we seem to have got to the slides. So that was the first two introduction slides. Now going to talk about that reduction of energy consumption. So for me, synthetic fuels are really important. They are something which we can use today, and we can introduce them into vehicles fitted with an internal combustion engine. So that's essentially most of the vehicles on the road today. And so these cleaner fuels reduce the level of CO2 emissions, and so therefore they make an immediate impact. They're readily transportable, and so providing an infrastructure for them is much simpler than some of the alternative options. So I feel that they are a short-term measure we should be taking. However, bear in mind that synthetic fuels essentially actually have an impact on the engine's efficiency, and also in actually creating synthetic fuels, we are making use of fossil carbon sources. So these are something which we can use today, but they should be seen as a short-term sort of step on our journey towards carbon reduction. We do hope that technological development will enable non-fossil carbon dioxide to be used in the production, and also really important that renewable energy is the basis upon which these fuels are produced in as carbon neutral a manner as possible. So looking into the future, I see hydrogen as having a major beneficial impact for people utilising vehicles. Essentially, what comes out the exhaust pipe is water. That's it. It's on the emission. And so from an emissions perspective, hydrogen-powered vehicles have a great deal to give. Now, at the moment, there are barriers to hydrogen. Essentially, the infrastructure is not there at the moment, and in addition, we need to use quite a lot of power to actually create our hydrogen. So two particular barriers, which in time we probably will be able to address, but they are present at the moment. However, in certain circumstances, hydrogen-powered vehicles are absolutely the solution today. So a fleet of refuse collection vehicles starts out and returns to the same location. You can store your hydrogen there, and they are particularly suited to hydrogen vehicle powering. Larger good vehicles in due course, when we have a greater infrastructure, very suitable again. These types of vehicles are not going to be suitable for electric power because of essentially the weight and the range which will be impacted by the use of electric power. And so at this moment, if you have a fleet setting out and returning to base, then hydrogen power is definitely an option. And into the future, think hydrogen, it's definitely going to be on our horizon. Meanwhile, today we have electric vehicles. So many of you will have seen electric vehicles, and essentially, so long as the electricity which is utilized to power those vehicles is generated from renewable sources, then powering those vehicles electrically is a big improvement and should happen. So we have a very positive infrastructure for charging electric vehicles. You can do that at home, at your base, and the range and number of public electric vehicle charging points is increasing all the time, and indeed the technology for the batteries is enabling the range of these vehicles to improve, and so encourage their selection. But they are a short and medium term option in my view. In the long term, the batteries are currently making use of precious resources such as lithium and cobalt, and therefore those precious resources we can ill afford to utilize, and so they ought not to be a major, shall we say, long-term solution. Just wanted to make reference to sensor operated lights as well. When we finally all return to our commercial buildings, very important that we don't utilize energy when we don't need it, and so encourage your organizations to utilize sensor operated lights. The downside of sitting at your desk and having to wave at the light if it's in the evening and as everyone else has left the office is far outweighed by the saving in energy use that is generated, and this has public lighting applications as well, which we should encourage. Make a switch to a greener tariff, very important. Individuals can do that on a consumer retail basis. Larger organizations can enter into power purchase agreements. So organizations should be looking to source their energy from as green a power provider as possible, and thereby supporting renewable energy generation. So what are those renewable sources that we're particularly looking at? Well, the first of those is the sun. It has a major contribution to make to our low carbon and renewable energy generation future. And so I mentioned here specifically solar farms, but the sun and its means of providing solar power of one type or another is really important. Your organization should be looking at the options for solar generation on the roofs if you have spare land, or indeed if you can access and become a part of a solar farm type arrangement. So we have one in a village in Langham out in Nottinghamshire, where there was a decision taken by the landowner that a part would be a commercial solar farm and a part would be set aside for the community. The community actually funded the construction of that part of the solar farm, and an organisation has been set up to run it. That organisation now derives the income from the generation, which enables it to provide a fund for green community projects on an annual basis, and it pays a healthy dividend to its shareholders year on year. I also feel that anaerobic digestion is really important. We need to maximize the calorific value from our waste, and so anaerobic digestion is particularly effective at that. It takes putrescible matter and is able to convert that into biomethane, and so an exceptionally useful power source, one that essentially from a finite resource perspective we will run out of in due course when we no longer have the gas that comes out of the ground, and so generating such gas is really important to us. There's still more work to be done to improve the technology. Unless you have a very secure and consistent type of input, then it's more difficult to ensure that the output is successful. But I'm aware of a specific example where vegetable offcuts, as it happens, leaks, are utilised to generate methane gas on a farm, and it's an absolute no-brainer, as I say there. Also like to mention district heating schemes. These schemes can make use of heat which is present due to combined heat and power, or some form of energy from waste arrangement, where warm or hot water is almost a byproduct, and so that hot water can be piped throughout a district and thereby heat buildings on its route. And so very important and useful low carbon means of heating. And so we have one in Nottingham. Manchester City Council is currently introducing one within the city centre. Hugely complex, but also it will provide a very ambitious project for that city centre. Looking ahead in relation to district heating schemes, it's been quite an active period. Support from BEIS, a decarbonisation plan, and consultation on development of a regulatory system with Ofgem as the regulator. in spring this year, the government allocated funding for a new green heat network scheme. And as Ben said, we are possibly going to have an energy white paper this autumn, which may have more to say on this subject, so watch this space. So I also would like to just very quickly cover indirect emissions. Green procurement, many of you may feel that this is some form of Cinderella type subject, but let me ask you this question. What happens if one of your major customers comes to you and says, demonstrate to us your environmental credentials? Ask yourself how your organization will perform. And if that hasn't happened to you yet, well, you may well be fortunate. What I do say to you is plan for it to do so now, because it will. More and more supply chains are being impacted by green procurement requirements and impositions. So expect it and plan for it and do what you can to ensure your organisation does not fall foul of it. Utilising green service providers. An example I'm aware of is a courier company called WeGo. Brilliant. They use rail, they use bicycles, and they're very reliable and provide their deliveries just as effectively and saving carbon in doing so. Excellent way forward. Think about embedded carbon. This is really important. Certain substances which we take for granted actually contain a lot of effort to get them to that point. Do we need to utilize that specific substance? Just starting to change people's mindsets such that they are actually thinking about what carbon did it take for us to have this here now is really important. And so potentially producing an embodied carbon database for your organizations and what your activities are is really important and valuable step to increase awareness and bring forward more greener options for similar types of utility. Just a few words on carbon offsetting. So Woodland Trust provide an offset. Very important that you bear in mind that if your organisation is simply not capable of achieving carbon neutrality from the reduction of its own emissions, well then in order to set that balance to zero, then you can purchase carbon offsets, Woodland Trust being one. Bear in mind that offsetting is not the only solution here. Generally, we ought to be reducing emissions so far as we possibly can, and there are certain difficulties associated with the types of offset schemes which are created. So government is essentially looking at whether or not the current voluntary arrangements for offsetting should be regulated to some degree. So that's another area to keep an eye on. There's a call for evidence in relation to transport carbon emissions last year, and the UN may have something to say about this as well. I wanted to just say a quick word about funding, because what West Berkshire have done is really innovative and great to see, enabling their local residents to invest into a secure green bond, which will enable the council to facilitate green carbon reducing measures, which provide a secure investment for the people in their district. And this is a very exciting model. I see it as one likely to be rolled out to further places throughout the UK in the very near future, so keep your eye out for it. I would also say that look out for a report from the Midlands Engine, which is going to cover the green recovery. That can be expected any time, a very important report which you should keep an eye on for green recovery measures. So, my final word, most important, do something and empower the convinced and convince the empowered. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 5-minute break. By my computer clock, it's 5 to 12, so we'll come back at 12 when David Elvin will take on the next session, which will be on biodiversity net gain in planning.
Right, well, it's now good afternoon, and I'm going to speak now on biodiversity net gain and the proposals in the bill as they currently stand. Doing this in 20 minutes is a bit of a challenge, but let's see how we do. Oops. The bill, as you know, was introduced in its current form in January following the general election, and there's a useful track changes version to show you the additions over the version of the bill that went in late 2019 before the election. Explanatory notes are very helpful, and indeed in many places, particularly with net gain, it explains things that might have been better put in the drafting of the provisions. You've then got, just to assist with the broad government intentions, you have the policy statement of the 30th of January, and then there are a whole series of fact sheets issued in March. Part 6 and 7, which are published together, deal with biodiversity and indeed nature conservation issues generally. Of course, the process started in 2018 with consultation on the governance provisions. Net gain was first consulted upon in December 2018 as well, and I've referred you there to the net gain consultation document, and the responses were published 6 months later in 2019. The parliamentary process is only just gearing up again. It went through second reading, it went to committee in March, but those ground to a halt because of lockdown, and there have been various motions, the latest one of which now requires the committee deliberations to end by the end of this month, and we'll see whether or not that's achieved. Of course, one of the interesting unanswered questions as yet as to how these proposals will integrate with the proposals in the white paper for the reforms to the planning system. My initial thought is, well, since the local plans will operate via permission in principle, and the principal mechanism, as I'll deal with in a moment, is a mandatory condition imposed on all permissions, including deemed permissions, it may well be that that is the answer to this, and they won't need to tweak too much the provisions that are going in the draft bill at the moment, but I dare say there'll be some changes. Current position, of course, is that biodiversity net gain, absent any specific local plan policies requiring otherwise, is essentially just an arm of mitigation at the moment. And I've given you some references in the current NPPF and the PPG on nature conservation. It's encouraged and it's provided in some cases beyond what is strictly necessary in mitigation, but at the moment, the duty is much more limited than the government would like. And of course, the duty under Section 40 of the National Environment and Rural Communities Act is only a have regard duty to biodiversity issues, and it's fairly weak. And you see on the consultation that's recognised, and the need to impose something which is much stronger and removes uncertainty from the system. The explanatory notes and much of the policy acknowledge that there is a need to address deterioration in the natural environment, both wildlife habitats, wildlife itself, and of course non-wildlife matters such as wildflowers, plants and the like. The bill seeks to improve biodiversity. There are a series, as you can see and you'll already know, of measures, of which the biodiversity net gain requirement is only one. Other issues that are going to impinge on planning considerations include the strengthened biodiversity duty under Section 40, local nature recovery strategies, although that will depend on how that's inserted into the system in its final form, conservation covenants, which partly go hand in hand with the net gain requirements. Just to note, there was an undertaking from the government, or an assurance in its 2019 response, that it will only implement the biodiversity net gain after 2 years from the date of royal assent. In other words, it will allow a generous transition period in order to allow the new provisions to settle in, and for those charged with dealing with them and those seeking to comply with them to get accustomed. And that's perhaps not surprising when I note that, for example, on biodiversity credits, Natural England only announced its pilot schemes to see how that would work just before the summer, and the pilot schemes which it has selected will not start until next month and will not conclude until February. So there'll be no feedback from the pilot biodiversity credit scheme, which of course is an important element of a biodiversity net gain and complying with the plan that's required to be submitted in no doubt a number of cases. That won't be known, and we won't know how that's going to operate nationwide until those pilots are concluded. The proposed mechanism is via a mandatory condition. Clause 90 of the bill applies Schedule 14 of the bill, which deals with the majority of the provisions. Clause 91 also introduces provisions via regulations to be made by the Secretary of State for a publicly accessible biodiversity gain site register for obligations which endure for 30 years or more, which are embodied in conservation covenants, and where the enhancement is to be made available in accordance with the terms of the covenant or the planning obligation to one or more developments once planning permission is granted. In other words, it's a register of sites to which developers may be able to apply in order to satisfy their biodiversity gain plan. The specific mechanism then is going to be via a schedule introduced into the 1990 Act, if indeed it still is the 1990 Act by the time we get there. Schedule 7A introduces the new provisions, and it, through paragraph 13, imposes a mandatory condition that a biodiversity gain plan has been submitted and that plan is approved. So effectively, you've got a negative condition which will not allow the development to commence until that plan has been submitted and approved. The objective is set out, the biodiversity gain objective, and essentially the value attributable to the development has got to exceed the pre-development value by at least the relevant percentage, which is set at 10% by paragraphs 2, 3, but that is subject to variation by regulation by the Secretary of State. So it possibly could go up as well as down. Biodiversity value takes regard of post-development biodiversity value, value in relation to the development of registered off-site biodiversity site allocated to the development, and the value of any biodiversity credits, hence the importance of the pilot scheme yet to commence. And the value is to be calculated in accordance with the biodiversity metric, which I'll come to in a moment briefly. That is yet to be in a final form because the consultation response from Natural England on the last set of consultations has been published, but it will not appear in its final form until it's about to be put into operation. Pre-development biodiversity value is essentially what it sounds like. The relevant date, which is the time by which it's to be judged, is effectively the date of the application or the date when permission is granted if it's deemed. There are anti-avoidance provisions, for example, if development's been carried out without permission or where in fact you're deemed to have the value which it would have otherwise been, but for the commencement of those activities which don't have planning permission. And then there's a special provision which doesn't allow you to take account of the failure to deliver registered biodiversity enhancements if it's been registered in the GAIN register. That is deemed to be what should have been achieved even if it hasn't. So there are some anti-avoidance provisions there. Post value means a projected value. Of course, it has to be projected at the date of the application, and that involves having regard to the metric. And they will only be taken into account if they've been secured by an appropriate mechanism, planning obligation, conservation covenant, etc. Registered offsite biodiversity gains I've mentioned. The biodiversity credits, the Secretary of State may make arrangements, as they're called, to purchase a credit. An arrangement consists of the various features that may affect price, terms, etc. And a credit is to be regarded as having been determined under the arrangements, of course, which have to be published. And the Secretary of State is also to have regard to setting sums which don't discourage the registration of land in the biodiversity register, because, of course, the last thing they want is to set the arrangements in a way which discourages registration. Otherwise, the system starts to break down. There are exclusions where permission is granted by development order or urgent Crown development, and the Secretary of State has power to widen the exclusions. There are modifications that the Secretary of State may make in the case of irreplaceable habitat, which is essentially the most important and generally internationally designated habitat sites, SPAs, SACs, SSIs, Ramsar sites and the like. That's been made clear, of course, that in many cases they're subject to their own controls and their own requirements for compensation and mitigation. And they will probably still remain within a similar structure to where they are at the moment, or at least that's what the explanatory notes suggest, but it requires the Secretary of State to modify the application of the biodiversity net gain provisions first. There are also other provisions in relation to phasing and Section 73A applications, i.e. Applications for consent retrospectively. Biodiversity gain, the metric. Now, that's been subject to several consultations. We're on what I think is called Biodiversity Metric 2.0 beta version. We've been told by Natural England that the final version will be published in December. The consultation response in August sets out, in summary, a very large number of points where Natural England accepts. I mean, the document is 9 pages long and consists largely of tables with feedback, theme, and proposed actions. In very many of those cases, Natural England has agreed to adjust the metric, but they're not going to publish the way in which they've adjusted the metric guidance document until they publish the final version. So there'll be no opportunity to check in relation to the proposed changes. Now, one issue which remains unclear is, do the requirements for biodiversity net gain apply to reserved matters applications? What happens, for example, if you have a planning permission granted before the transitional date ends, but the reserved matters approval is after the transitional 2 years ends? Well, at the moment, the bill refers to planning permission, outlined, detailed, or deemed. The explanatory notes are placed, and I've given you some examples, on planning permissions and not on subsidiary consents. And as you will know, established case law distinguishes applications for permission from reserved matters applications, which are not applications for permission in themselves, but merely subsidiary approvals, as we know, under existing permissions. There's no suggestion that they should apply retrospectively to permissions granted before the end of the transitional period, and indeed it would run contrary to the assurance the government has given if they were to do so. So it seems unlikely that it would apply, even if planning permissions were construed to include reserved matters approvals, which I don't think they would. And more than anything, there is no need to include reserved matters approvals, since the condition in paragraph 13 of the new Schedule 7A will be imposed by operation of law on all permissions, other than those that are excluded, granted after Part 6 comes into effect, and therefore any reserved matters application made in respect of a permission granted after Part 6 comes into force will be subject to that overriding mandatory condition. And so you have the certainty which paragraph 13 deemed condition creates. Contrast, for example, section 73 examples and the sort of messes that have arisen in cases like Lambeth, where there has been a failure to replicate conditions that were intended still to continue. That shouldn't occur in this case. And indeed, the government has sought to assure developers that there will be clarity, consistency, etc., and in guidance to help, and good guidance to help developers design net gain into their processes. And we're told that the practical guidance will make it clear to developers what they need to do and how those requirements interact with other requirements. Now, that is a challenge that government has set itself. And of course, here we are still not knowing how the details are going to work out, how it will integrate with the new system when reforms are introduced, with a biodiversity credits pilot scheme not yet begun, and a biodiversity amendments to the metric, amendments to the biodiversity metric, which we've yet to see. So I hope the government meets the challenge. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to James.
Hello, I'm going to be covering air quality issues in planning, and I wanted to start with some key points. Air quality legislation and policy, and I'm going to explore this a little bit, is voluminous, complex, and increasingly so. Air quality is, of course, you will now all know, very commonly an issue on planning applications and planning appeals. The main issue is often nitrogen dioxide, but it's not the only pollutant that arises in planning cases at the moment. We also have the issue around, related issue around nitrogen deposition, ammonia, and particulate matter. Just looking at NO2 for a moment, the main source of NO2 is transport, albeit there are other major sources like power generation, industrial processes, and domestic heating, but transport is a really big factor. And so an air quality issue potentially arises in a planning case in respect of any proposed development that has a net traffic increase as a result of the development. And the result of all that is increasingly air quality is a popular ground of objection by third parties. It's increasingly used as a reason for refusal by local authorities. Whether, and be frank about this, whether that's genuinely, as it is in some cases, because the local authority is concerned about air quality, or whether, as in some cases, it's simply a useful handle to refuse a development that members don't like the look of. Thirdly, as a result of that, increasingly, it's a main issue on Section 78 appeals and call-ins. And fourthly, increasingly, developers are being asked to provide via conditions and Section 106 obligations mitigation for the potential air quality impacts that their development will give rise to. So I start with the planning practice guidance, which has a heading in the air quality section: what specific issues may need to be considered when assessing air quality impacts. And there's a useful summary there, I think, of when these issues can arise. So first of all, when your development can lead to changes in vehicle-related emissions, either in the immediate vicinity of the proposed development or further afield. And that can be through altering level of traffic congestion, significantly changing traffic volumes or vehicle speeds or both, or significantly altering the traffic composition on local roads. Secondly, these issues can arise if you're introducing a new point source of air pollution. So that would be pollution from a particular place. So this would not be residential development, but some form of industrial development with a stack, for example. Thirdly, if you expose people to harmful concentrations of air pollutants. So this arises where a developer seeks to build new homes or schools or offices in an area that's already got a poor air quality issue. And then finally, the final sort of indication of where these issues can arise is potentially unacceptable impacts such as dust during construction for nearby sensitive locations. And biodiversity is then specifically mentioned, and I'll touch on biodiversity quite briefly towards the end. So what about this legislative background that I mentioned? Can we just start with EU derived? Legislative background, as I said, is complex, seems to me to be getting ever more complex. So we start with the 2008 Ambient Air Quality Directive, the Air Quality Directive as it's nearly always referred to. And we all know that sets legally binding limits for concentrations of outdoor air of major air pollutants that impact public health, such as particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide. You'll know this is the directive that requires the UK to be divided into zones, imposes an obligation in Article 13 that those zones meet certain limit values. We know that on NO2, the UK has largely failed to do that and has needed to have put in place under Article 23 a plan, and that plan has been subject, as you all know, to multiple challenges by Client Earth going back several years now. All of the obligations in the directive are transposed in the air quality standards regulations. There are some other important EU legislation that you should just briefly think about. The Fourth Daughter Directive, which deals with arsenic and a few other pollutants, which is also transposed by the 2010 regulations. Directive 2015-1480, which has all the detailed information around methods, data validation, sampling points for assessing ambient air quality under the directive. And there's also a Commission implementing decision in relation to all of this. Still sticking with EU-derived legislation, we've also got the National Emission Ceilings Directive, transposed now through 2018 regs, setting national emission reduction targets for PM 2.5, ammonia, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and also catchily named NMVOCs. And if you're looking at these, you also need to look at the international law context, which is the Gothenburg Protocol. And then there's also, of course, the Industrial Emissions Directive, transposed by the Environmental Permitting Regulations, if you're looking at permission for a facility that's caused by those provisions. Of course, all of this will be retained law following Brexit, but I mean, there's a few things that you can sort of immediately note. I mean, first of all, the UK will be free to repeal any and all retained law after the implementation period is over, unless any deal with the EU prevents this. And I think Ben's already mentioned the negotiations not going well. I think while we've been doing this webinar, it's been announced on the news that the head of the GLD has resigned over the current Brexit negotiation position, so we can see how well things are going there. Secondly, the UK is not obliged to update any of its legislation if there are amendments to existing EU directives or regulations on air quality, again, unless any deal, should there be one, requires that, nor any new EU air quality law wouldn't necessarily be, well, it wouldn't be required to be transposed in the UK. Of course, post-exit case law of the European Court, post-exit case law from the CJEU, not binding. And the Supreme Court European Court case law. And you may have seen there's an ongoing consultation by the government to make regulations under the Brexit legislation that would actually allow other courts, so lower courts down to High Court level, to themselves depart from pre-exit case law. If you're interested in that, there's a very good submission that was made by the Bar European group about why that might not be a terribly good idea. But we'll see what the government does with that in due course. And then finally, the legislative background, we've got the domestic. So obviously, we'll have the retained EU law, see above. There's some old domestic legislation that still is in force, like the 2000 regulations. We've also got, of course, got the 1995 Act, which requires local authorities to review air quality in the area, to designate AQMAs where there's an issue with air quality, and to have an action plan for those AQMAs. And these plans themselves contribute to achieving limit values at local level. And then there's also the Clean Air Act 1993, which still remains in force. And then on top of all of that, as if we needed more, the Environment Bill, Clause 2, is going to require the government to set and meet air quality targets for fine particulate matter in ambient air. And you can see the current form of Clause 2 in the web links that David Elvin has given you in his talk to the current version of the bill. The government has said it will introduce a legally binding target on PM 2.5 under those provisions by, I think the date is 2022. They'll have to take advice, there'll have to be consultation, and there's been a bit of a debate about whether that should be the WHO target for PM 2.5. There was an attempt to include that specifically in the bill, which I think was defeated, but that is still no doubt one of the targets that will be under consideration. The bill also is going to make some amendments to the Clean Air Act, and it's also amending the 1995 Act to try and strengthen the duties and give greater sort of requirements to be imposed in relation to action plans, etc. Plus, there'll be a requirement to regularly review the national air quality strategy that's been made under the 1995 Act. So change coming on the domestic front in any way. How does one make sense of all this law? Well, I mean, there's quite a, I think, useful summary, out of date now, but still useful, in the DEFRA publication Air Pollution in the UK 2015, because it breaks down the legislation into three types. So legislation regulating total emissions of air pollutants, so that's the National Emission Ceilings Directive and international law and our transposing regs. Secondly, legislation regulating concentrations of pollutants in the air, so that will be the Air Quality Directive. And then legislation regulating emissions from specific sources, such as legislation implementing the Industrial Emissions Directive and the Clean Air Act. I think that threefold definition is quite a useful way of sorting out in one's own mind the different layers of legislation that are in place. So can we turn then to the policy? Well, I mean, we have to start with the NPPF. It's only really got one paragraph on air quality, important paragraph though it is. Planning decisions should sustain and contribute towards compliance with relevant limit values or national objectives for pollutants, taking into account the presence of AQMAs and clean air zones, and also cumulative impacts. It then goes on to tell us that opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate impacts should be identified, such as through traffic and travel management, green infrastructure provision and enhancement. So far as possible, we're then told these opportunities should be considered at the plan making stage so that it can be dealt with strategically and limit the need for these issues to be reconsidered in determining individual applications. And then finally, planning decisions should ensure that any new development in an AQMA and a clean air zone is consistent with the action plan that's in place for those areas or zones. The PPG provides some further guidance. I've already set out some of that in an earlier slide, and I'll come back to some other guidance in the PPG later on. We've also got, obviously mostly relevant for nationally significant infrastructure projects, but those policies in national policy statements under the 2008 Act can also be material considerations in other planning contexts. The National Networks NPS has a test on air quality compliance. The airport's MPS also deals with air quality. One of the grounds of challenge, one of the thousands of grounds of challenge that there was to the Heathrow policy, was focused on air quality. It argued that the Secretary of State needed to set out his legal interpretation of what the Air Quality Directive required and meant for Heathrow expansion, and that was rejected by the Divisional Court and didn't go to the Court of Appeal. And then finally, there's a myriad of local planning and other policies on air quality. What about other policy? Well, there's still more. We've got the Article 23 plan for the UK. So that's the plan that we have to have in place under the directive because we are non-compliant in many of our zones on nitrogen dioxide. There's a supplement to that plan as well. The plan and the supplement to it are what has emerged after the many client earth judicial reviews we've seen over the last few years. We've also got the Clean Air Strategy. That's separate. It complements 3 other strategies: the Industrial Strategy, the Clean Growth Strategy, and the 25-year Environment Plan. We've got reducing emissions from road transport, the Road to Zero Strategy, and then we've got the Air Quality Strategy, which I mentioned a moment ago, under the 1995 Act, and in respect of which, as I mentioned, the bill is going to include a provision to ensure periodic review of that. The Air Quality Strategy is actually quite old now, and that may be the reason to have a requirement to review it more regularly. But layer upon layer of policy. So where does that all take us? Refusing planning permission on air quality grounds. Well, there's 2 Court of Appeal cases that I think help us set the parameters around refusal of planning permission on air quality grounds. And those are the cases of Shirley in the Court of Appeal and Gladman in the Court of Appeal. So I'll look at both of those, but my summary of the position is that it comes down to 3 points. One is air quality is an important material consideration in planning. 2, planning can be refused on the basis that potential air quality impacts are going to be negative and therefore permission refused. But thirdly, whatever the position is in the area that your development is, or the zone, if you're talking about the directive, in terms of compliance with the Air Quality Directive, and irrespective of whether your development is in or close to an AQMA that's been declared, there is not ever a legal obligation to refuse planning permission for a development that worsens air quality. It is one of those issues that feeds into the overall planning balance. And really, it's Shirley that establishes that, I think, most clearly. So this was a challenge to a refusal by the Secretary of State to call in a planning decision following a local planning authority's resolution to grant permission for 4,000 homes on the outskirts of Canterbury. Now, in Canterbury, they had an AQMA, which had been extended to cover almost all of the area of the city within the ring road. And local measurements, so measurements undertaken by the council for the purposes of the 1995 Act, showed that there was exceedances of NO2 of the 40 micrograms per cubic metre limit, which is of course the limit value in the directive and also under other standards. Now, in terms of the directive, the position is actually a bit more complicated than that. Canterbury was in the southeast zone for the purposes of the directive. There was a monitoring station for the purposes of measuring air quality under the directive quite close to Canterbury, but not in Canterbury. And that monitoring station showed compliance at that particular point. But the zone as a whole was a non-compliant zone, although bizarrely, that was largely because of exceedances in air quality in the centre of Oxford, for which, not surprisingly, Canterbury City Council had no responsibility. But the issue that arose in Shirley was effectively, are you required to refuse planning permission for any development in a zone that's non-compliant if you're going to make make air quality any worse? And I just put a little warning there. There were some, I think, pretty confused arguments about all of this from the claimants, because you cannot rely on local measurements done by the council under the 1995 Act to say that the limits in the directive have been breached, because there is a very specific way under the directive and other EU legislation set out how you monitor and measure and model air quality in order to see whether there is an impact on the limit values in the directive. And of course, in Canterbury itself, under the directive, the monitoring station showed no breach. But the case was fought, as I said, on the basis of, look, it's a non-compliant zone, therefore you shouldn't grant permission for anything that's going to worsen air quality, and the Secretary of State must call it in and either refuse permission or impose such strict conditions that there could be no adverse air quality impact. And indeed, the suggestion the claimant made was a complete ban on all car ownership for residents of the 4,000 homes to be built. So the court rejected those arguments. It said the Air Quality Directive contains its own remedy for any breaches of Article 13, i.e. for the existence of a zone that's not compliant. The requirement is the requirement under Article 23 to establish and implement an air quality plan, which is effective to reduce the periods of exceedance. Therefore, there's no basis for reading in a duty to take a particular action in relation to permits or development consents, i.e. call in and or refuse. So Lord Justice Lindblom said that the judge below's description of Article 23 as providing a specific and bespoke remedy for a breach of Article 13 therefore seems apt. The case law does not suggest, for example, that in such circumstances, breach of Article 13, non-compliant zone, a member state must ensure that land use planning powers and duties are exercised in a particular way, such as by imposing a moratorium on grants of planning permission for particular forms of development or for development of a particular scale, whose effect might be to perpetuate or increase exceedances of limit values. And then, in addition, the court said these are material considerations, of course, but there is no requirement to refuse permission because you are going to add to air quality pollutants in a non-compliant zone. And indeed, the Court of Appeal went on to say the Secretary of State acknowledges in these proceedings the effects of development on air quality in a local area or more widely, or the likely consequences of the development for compliance with limit values under the directive are capable of being, in a particular case, a decisive factor in the determination of an application, but there is no requirement that you refuse. This is something that goes to the planning balance ultimately. And then Gladman is perhaps an illustration of that, although it's a slightly unusual case for a reason that I'll come on to in a moment. So here, planning permission was refused by the local planning authority for 330 dwellings plus a 60 care unit facility. The Section 78 appeal was made, and at the time the appeal was determined, the Article 23 air quality plan had been quashed because of the Client Earth litigation. And at the point the inspector had to decide this, no new plan was in place. And I think that's what makes this a quite unusual set of facts, because obviously we now have a plan in place and a supplement to the plan that has survived the various legal challenges. And the inspector in this case was in a particularly difficult position because he had no plan. He found it would be unsafe to rely on vehicle emissions falling to the extent assumed in the models relied on by the claimant, and that despite proposed mitigation measures put forward by the claimant, the proposals would have an adverse effect on air quality and therefore refused planning permission. And the developer challenged that under Section 288. And the claimant argued two things. First of all, the inspector should have proceeded on the basis that the government would comply with the law, rather than assuming that breaches of the Air Quality Directive and the regulations would continue. Secondly, the inspector failed to give effect to the principle in paragraph 122 of the NPPF that the planning system presumed that other schemes of regulatory control were legally effective. Now, the claim failed on both grounds, and I'm going to focus on point one on the slide, but two is also of interest. We all know that other controls, for example, environmental permit for a new point source emission, is something that planning shouldn't seek to duplicate, but that's not relevant, the Court of Appeal have confirmed, for air quality issues in terms of ambient air and more generally, for example, with a housing scheme. And I think it was crucial that here the air quality plan had been quashed at the time of the decision and there was not a new one in place. And so What did the Court of Appeal say? They said the duty to produce and implement an air quality plan by the earliest possible date did not mean that planning decision makers had to presume the UK would become compliant in the near future. That where it was not known what measures would be in the new National Air Quality Plan, the inspector could not know how any new national measures might relate to local measures, or what might be the soonest possible date on which the plan would aim to achieve compliance. And that the inspector therefore could not have reached any view as to whether compliance would be secured by any particular date, and he was not thus required to assume that air quality would improve by any particular amount or with any particular time frame, and instead he had to look at all the evidence. Now, that's a world, that decision was made in a world that's probably now gone, because we do have a plan in place, but I think there is at least a line of argument that one doesn't have to assume that what the government say will happen, but with a new plan in place that survived legal challenge, that is a more likely result. And then mitigation. So to avoid getting refused on air quality grounds, mitigation is important. Now in Gladman, the inspector was not satisfied about the efficacy of the mitigation. The inspector said the proposed measures include electrical vehicle charging points for each dwelling, green travel measures, incentives to encourage the use of walking, cycling, public transport, and electric or low emission vehicles. No specific evidence has been provided, however, to show how effective those measures are likely to be in reducing the use of private petrol and diesel vehicles, and hence in reducing forecast NO2 emissions. So a finding on the particular evidence, but similar mitigation has been accepted elsewhere by local authorities and inspectors, and frankly with little more evidence than was available in the Gladman case. And just as by way of contrast, in Shirley, the developer was putting forward a scheme that would cost approximately 3.7 million, providing an air quality mitigation package that would include the installation of domestic electric vehicle charging points in both the residential and commercial areas, monitoring, and the provision of an electric bicycle for every dwelling. You remember there was 4,000 dwellings on that scheme, and that mitigation scheme was accepted by the local planning authority in that case. Mitigation for air quality is dealt with in the planning practice guidance. It tells us they need to be locationally specific. What's required needs to be proportionate with impact. And there are then examples given as to what could be provided: maintaining distances between pollution and receptors, using green infrastructure, new green infrastructure or existing, appropriate means of filtration and ventilation, promoting sustainable forms of transport with low air quality impacts, controlling dust and emissions at the construction stage, and contributing or funding to measures, including those that are identified, for example, in air quality action plans and low emission strategies. And so if you look at them, we've got a whole series of things one can be looking at, very commonly now put forward to be included in Section 106 obligations or conditions. So encouraging non-car-based trips, travel plans, routing, if there's a particular air quality black spot, on-site cycle infrastructure, electric car charging points, discouraging or preventing car ownership other than electric cars, green infrastructure, electric bikes, and TROs, for example, to reduce speed limits. One needs to think creatively. That's not a comprehensive list, but an important part of getting your scheme through where there's an air quality issue is having a sound, comprehensive mitigation package and evidence to show that it will work. And finally, just briefly to mention habitats, which I did touch on right at the beginning. I've not focused on those issues. Largely, I've been focused on air quality legislation that's itself focused on human health. But there obviously are considerable issues that arise in relation to nitrogen deposition and the impact on European sites. And that has led to moratoriums on development around Ashdown Forest and also Epping Forest. And in relation to the Ashdown Forest, we've seen much litigation in past years where the council effectively sought to stop all development that generated one additional vehicle trip through the forest. Wealden have moved away from that position now. Interestingly, in Wealden, the moratorium was driven by the council, not by Natural England. In Epping Forest, it's different. The moratorium is driven by advice given by Natural England. not being driven by the local authority. And then finally, just ask you to note the Compton case on the Guildford local plan. Despite what's said by the European Court in Dutch nitrogen, you can properly have regard to anticipated reductions in background AQ levels if evidence supports the view that they are sufficiently certain to happen. And I think that is an alternative approach to what happened in Gladman, but obviously ultimately it's a question of judgment on the evidence in any particular case. Unfortunately, I can't go into it further. It's a whole talk in itself, habitats and air quality, so I'm going to stop there and we'll turn to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, James and David. I'm sure all of the attendees would like me to thank you on their collective behalves for that substantial insight into those two very topical issues. David, first, if I may, a couple of questions for you. First one. Is there an interface between biodiversity net gain and permission in principle?
Right. I did send through brief notes on this, but just to expand slightly, the paragraph 13 mandatory condition applies to all permissions, but paragraph 17 excludes permissions granted by development order. And of course, one of the ways in which permission in principle may be granted is by development order. There are two oddities about this. Firstly, not all permissions in principle need to be granted by development order. They may be granted pursuant to powers conferred by the order on the local authority. And secondly, if you look at the explanatory notes to the Act, to the bill, which are very lengthy, there is no mention whatsoever of permission in principle. And if you look at, I think it's paragraph 1573 on paragraph 17, it's clearly directed to GPDO rights where there's no application. In other words, there's no application to which you can attach the condition. That wouldn't necessarily be the case where power had been conferred under development order on a local authority and you had to apply for permission in principle to the authority. So I'm not sure it's intended to exclude permissions in principle. That said, of course, I suppose it would be open to the development order to impose the same condition on permissions in principle via development order. This is one of those interfaces which will come into more focus with the proposed amendments to the local plan system, which may need tinkering with.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. And the second question: could a council require development to meet 10% biodiversity net gain now, even if it does not have a policy in the local plan? And obviously, at this stage, the provisions are contained in a bill.
My view on this is no, it can't. There's a lot in the NPPF, paragraph 170 and 174, and indeed the PPG, which seeks to encourage it. But when push comes to shove, and you look at paragraph 175A, and indeed if you look at SIL Regs 122, what you're looking at effectively is mitigation or compensation in last resort. Mitigation doesn't seem to me to admit of biodiversity net gain because by definition, it's a gain over what's there at the moment, and so you're not mitigating. And the PPG proceeds on the basis of encouragement, recognising in paragraph 19 that you're applying the mitigation hierarchy in most cases. If you look at the government's consultation paper in December 2018, you can also see an acknowledgement that the current system isn't strong enough, hence the need for the condition. So for the reasons I've just said, and because the whole purpose behind the bill is to require this, I don't think you can say there's a requirement to provide it. And indeed, whilst for example, in the recent solar farm DCO on the Kent Marshes, which I won't speak kindly of since I only live 10 miles from the site, it was taken into account as a benefit, but not mandatory as such. So it may be a benefit, but I don't think authorities can require it.
Thank you, David. Now, David, I know that you've got to go. So, is there anything else you'd like to add before I just say thank you one more time?
No, just as I've already indicated, my concerns about the uncertainties, particularly a lot of the pilot testing and key issues such as the metric and the credits, still remain to be finally fleshed out even before we resume committee hearings in Parliament. And it just worries me that a lot of this is sort of work out the detail, which is pretty critical to everyone after the event, and that it's all going to happen after royal assent, assuming it can be made to work satisfactorily. And I do have some concerns about that.
Very good. Okay. Well, I'm sure if we were all present in person, there would be an impromptu round of applause now for you, David. Thank you very much.
Anyway, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for your introduction, Richard. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
So, Ben, there's been a couple of questions relating to the building regulations. So the first one is essentially asking about the degree to which building regulations are failing to keep up with, if you like, green aspirations. And do you have any kind of guidance for us on the extent to which we might see change within the building regulations going forward?
Thank you, Richard. Well, I mentioned earlier that there's likely to be some change within the building regulations for the future homes strategy, but it'd be great. I mean, the important thing is that if we're being made to stick to building regulations, that building regulations are reflecting of what can be done, what the technology says. Unfortunately, there's been no discussion that I've seen about how they will ensure that these are kept up to date. But I share the concerns of the person who asked the question, is that they will need to be kept up to date to ensure that the best methods are adopted.
Yeah. And I guess there's a degree of nervousness around building regulations purely as a result of the ongoing Grenfell inquiry as well, which just kind of adds an additional layer of uncertainty to things at the moment.
Of course, they need to make sure they get building regulations correct, so they need to think about them, but they also need to be adaptive as technology changes, and people's, what they will accept and what schemes can sustain is changes. So
sure. And so second question, Ben, relates to the extent to which authorities should be considering the current version of the building regulations, or should authorities be mindful of what is coming down the line and looking to seek to requirements which might be expected through future revisions to the building regulations, say in Part L?
I think the easy answer to this question is you should be considering what the building regulations currently are. Obviously, there is having half an eye to what's coming down the line, what building into your strategies and your policies, the ability to not contradict what's coming along. But we don't actually know what's in planning for the future yet. We don't really know the detail of the changes. So you should really be sticking to the current building regulations.
Okay, thanks very much. And just to deal with a question that we've had, we will be sending the slides and also a recording of the video of this webinar shortly after the webinar finishes to all of the attendees. So expect that in your inboxes anytime soon. Now, if I could turn to you, James, you you had a moment to catch your breath now. First question is about possibility of a moratorium on housing, and the potential impact of nitrates on the solant. The question is, how long can any such moratorium be continued, do you think?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think the solant obviously raises a different set of issues, not about air quality, but it does have a lot of similarities to the air quality issues that we've seen in Epping and Wealden. I mean, in theory, because there is, under the Habitats Directive, unlike under the other air quality legislation, unlike under the EIA legislation, a specific prohibition on granting development if you're going to have an adverse effect on integrity. In theory, it could be forever, because you have to have the evidence to show that the development that you want to put forward is not going to have that effect. And I mean, obviously that is hugely difficult in these kinds of situations, because often what you're talking about is the in combination effect. So, when you go back to Wealden, for example, when they, as they often did a few years back, refused planning permission for a single house because that would generate, a couple of extra trips through the forest, no one seriously thought that that in itself would impact on the forest in any kind of meaningful way. But you had to consider that in combination with all the other development. And then, how does that individual deal with that and mitigate it? And so this is why these issues do drag on, and in theory could go on forever. I think what's going to be interesting is, of course, that once we've left the implementation period and EU law is no longer something that has to be in the form in which we've become used to it, I guess the question is whether the government, in its current mood of build, build, build and deregulate, will weaken the habitats legislation, which, frankly, depending on your perspective, has pros and cons. Obviously, there are cons, and the legislation is there to protect habitats. On the other hand, I think the scenarios that we've got ourselves into around Wealden, Epping, and Solent can't be allowed to continue, because the other impacts of not, for example, building any housing in an area are very significant. And we can't sort of go on with it. And I mean, I guess one issue that's been talked about a lot is, in the end, can you use IROPI to justify housing? Because if you can't build any housing for a while, in the end, any provision of housing, I think you could argue IROPI on. The problem with IROPI is alternatives, which is nightmarish for housing, because what do you look at? Build elsewhere in the country. So I think it's difficult. I mean, at the moment, unfortunately, if you are a developer who's losing out on that moratorium, there isn't an easy answer to it. I think legislation may change when we leave the European Union fully, for better or worse. Beyond that, I think we need to think about some very inventive solutions about how we can stop this kind of block to development happening, because it does, I think, when it operates in this way, it does allow those who don't like the legislation to use it as an argument against the legislation. So I think if you believe in the legislation, it's really important we think of inventive ways to get around this. And Natural England have a particular responsibility to try and find a way through on some of this stuff.
Yes, and of course they did a great job in relation to Thames Basin heaths, with the suitable alternative natural green space, and so it, as you say, has to be something which has that kind of innovative solution associated with it, which will be somehow facilitative in a way which enables a reasonable level of development to occur. And so I think probably what we've concluded from that answer is that we've written the topic of our next seminar, James, and
Yes.
I think that is a really good point for us to draw this to a close now, and say thank you once again to James, to David, who has now departed, but made such a fantastic contribution in relation to his predictions for how legislation not yet in force, which is clearly impacted by changes in government policy, and gave us great insight into that. James, I found your insight into the air quality issues fascinating. In equal measure, presents a lot of challenges for us, and I think you kind of adverted to it. We have work to do on the evidence here, and so that's something that planners and those associated with these kind of issues need to look at, and probably we need to feed back to government for financial support for that kind of level of pilot program and test to try and establish how appropriate measures are, and what is most effective to help solve what is unquestionably a serious issue. And Ben, thank you very much as well. Lots of people talk about not net zero, but we don't often actually get a legal overview as you provided, which really places things in context, and enables us all to understand the issues that we face in this arena. And hopefully I gave you a few ideas about things that you can do from a more positive and practical point of view. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'm sure both Landmark and Browne Jacobson look forward to seeing you again at some similar event like this. Hopefully maybe we can do something on nitrates and habitats, James.
Definitely.
Jolly good. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.